In September 1939, as war erupted in Europe, the world's greatest engineers had all failed to solve one problem: how to make a machine hover safely in midair. Every attempt at vertical flight ended in disaster. Engines spun out of control, rotors tore themselves apart, and many pilots paid with their lives. The experts said true helicopters were impossible, a fantasy doomed by physics and human error. But in a small workshop in Connecticut, an ex-immigrant named Igor Sikorsky built a machine that defied every law and every skeptic. His secret? He embraced the flaw everyone else tried to fight. But at the time, few people outside his small team understood what he had done. By the late 1930s, the world was obsessed with flight. Airliners crossed oceans, bombers threatened cities, and every nation dreamed of machines that could rise straight up from the earth. But in every workshop, the promise of vertical flight turned to fear. Helicopter prototypes bucked, spun, and shattered, leaving test pilots bruised or dead. In France, Germany, and the United States, engineers watched their dreams collapse in clouds of splintered wood and twisted metal. The problem was always the same. When the main rotor spun, the whole machine fought back, twisting itself into chaos. Torque was the silent killer, and no one could tame it. While generals demanded a hovering rescue craft for the coming war, the experts shook their heads. The physics were merciless. The failures were public. The world's best minds declared the true helicopter impossible. Into this world stepped Igor Sikorsky. He was not a product of privilege or power. Born in Kiev in 1889, the youngest child of a respected but modest family, Sikorsky grew up in a Russia on the edge of revolution. As a boy, he built model helicopters from rubber bands and wood, inspired by the sketches of Leonardo da Vinci and the stories of Jules Verne. By his teens, he was building real flying machines, crude, dangerous, but always a step closer to the dream. When the Bolsheviks seized power, Sikorsky fled, penniless, to America. He arrived in New York with little more than a notebook and a vision: to build the world's first true helicopter. In the United States, Sikorsky was an outsider. He worked as a tutor, a lecturer, a factory hand. But he never let go of the dream. Every spare dollar went into experiments. Every failure was a lesson. By 1938, he had built and crashed more prototypes than most engineers would dare imagine. The world saw a refugee tinkering in a Connecticut workshop. Sikorsky saw the future. But the existing system had a fatal flaw that no one had solved. To understand why Sikorsky's achievement was revolutionary, you have to understand the problem that haunted every would-be helicopter pioneer: torque. When a single main rotor spins to lift a machine off the ground, it doesn't just pull the air down. It tries to spin the entire aircraft in the opposite direction. The result? The moment the skids leave the ground, the entire machine spins out of control, like a car hitting black ice at speed, helpless, accelerating, and seconds from disaster. Engineers tried everything: twin rotors spinning in opposite directions, coaxial blades stacked on top of each other, even tip jets that blasted air from the ends of the blades. Each solution brought new problems: unbearable vibration, mechanical complexity, catastrophic failure. In Germany, the Fock-Achgelis FA-61 managed a few cautious flights, but only in the hands of the bravest test pilots, and only after years of trial and error. In France, the Breguet Durand gyroplane spun itself to pieces. In America, autogyros could glide, but not hover. The dream of controlled vertical flight seemed cursed. The numbers were merciless. A main rotor spinning at 250 revolutions per minute could generate over 1,000 foot-pounds of torque, enough to twist steel, snap drive shafts, and rip engines from their mounts. Every attempt to outsmart torque ended in disaster. The more power you added, the more violent the spin. The more you tried to balance the forces, the more the machine shook itself apart. The physics were simple, the consequences brutal. The experts were united in their skepticism. A true helicopter is a mechanical impossibility, wrote one aviation journal in 1937. The forces involved cannot be controlled by any known means. Engineers at major firms dismissed the idea as a dangerous distraction. Investors laughed. The US Army, desperate for a rescue craft, quietly shelved its helicopter contracts after a string of fatal crashes. Most inventors gave up. The rest were ridiculed. But Sikorsky saw something others missed. Where others saw chaos, he saw a pattern. Where others tried to cancel torque with more machinery, he wondered, what if you simply redirected it? What if, instead of fighting the flaw, you used it? In 1939, Sikorsky decided to prove them all wrong. He began work on a machine that would change the world, the VS-300. Sikorsky's first prototype was a study in contradictions: crude, elegant, fragile, and bold. In the spring of 1939, inside a drafty hangar in Stratford, Connecticut, he and a handful of loyal engineers assembled the VS-300. The machine looked almost skeletal: a welded steel frame, a single main rotor above, a small engine behind the pilot's seat, and, most radical of all, a tiny tail rotor mounted sideways at the end of a long boom. It was a gamble. No one had ever tried to tame torque with a simple spinning blade at the tail. Sikorsky's rivals called it a child's toy, a death trap, a last resort for desperate men. The first test was a disaster. As the engine coughed to life, the main rotor blurred overhead, and Sikorsky eased the throttle forward. The machine shuddered, lifted a few inches, and spun violently to the right. The tail rotor screamed, fighting the twist, but the control linkages jammed. The VS-300 lurched sideways, skids scraping the concrete, before Sikorsky killed the engine. The hangar filled with the smell of burning oil and the silence of failure. For most men, that would have been the end, but Sikorsky was relentless. He worked through the night, covered in grease, reworking the tail rotor controls, reinforcing the frame, and scribbling notes in the margins of his blueprints. Every failure was a clue. Every broken part was a lesson. He believed that progress was not a straight line, but a spiral, each revolution bringing him closer to the truth. The next test flight solved the spin, but unleashed a new demon: vibration. The entire machine shook so violently that bolts rattled loose and the engine threatened to tear itself from its mounts. Sikorsky's hands went numb on the controls. The team tried new dampers, adjusted the rotor pitch, and replaced the wooden blades with metal. Each fix brought a new problem. The VS-300 would hover, but only for seconds. The tail rotor would counter the torque, but the machine would drift sideways, refusing to hold a steady position. The press caught wind of the project. Reporters arrived expecting a miracle. Instead, they saw a battered contraption wobbling across the tarmac, trailing smoke and embarrassment. Headlines mocked Sikorsky's flying skeleton. Investors grew nervous. The army, watching from the sidelines, sent a polite letter. "We regret to inform you that further funding is not available at this time." Sikorsky's team shrank. Some engineers left, convinced the project was doomed. But a core group remained, drawn by Sikorsky's quiet conviction and the sense that they were on the edge of something historic. They worked in shifts, testing new rotor shapes, experimenting with control linkages, and logging every result. Sikorsky himself flew every test, risking his life with each attempt. He believed that the only honest engineering was the kind you flew yourself. By late 1939, the VS-300 could hover for minutes at a time, but it was still uncontrollable in forward flight. The moment Sikorsky tried to move ahead, the machine pitched and yawed unpredictably. The solution, he realized, was not just mechanical, but aerodynamic. He redesigned the rotor head, adding a swash plate to allow for cyclic pitch control, giving the pilot the ability to tilt the rotor disc and steer the machine in any direction. It was a breakthrough, but it required a complete rebuild of the control system. Winter arrived. The hangar was unheated. The tools froze to the engineers' hands, and the engine refused to start in the cold. Sikorsky's health suffered. He lost weight, slept in his office, and wrote letters to his family in the early hours, promising that success was close. The team pressed on, driven by the vision of a machine that could save lives. In May 1940, after months of relentless work, the VS-300 lifted off for its first free flight. Sikorsky hovered, moved forward, backward and sideways, controlling the machine with a precision no one had ever seen. The army took notice. They sent observers, then engineers, then contracts. The VS-300 became the blueprint for the world's first mass-produced helicopter, the Sikorsky R-4. But there was one final test. In April 1944, deep in the jungles of Burma, a Sikorsky R-4 was dispatched to rescue wounded soldiers trapped behind enemy lines. The pilot, Carter Harmon, flew through heat, rain, and enemy fire, lifting each man to safety, one at a time. The helicopter that had once been mocked as a toy had become a lifeline. By the end of the war, Sikorsky's design was the only helicopter flying in combat, the only one rescuing the wounded, the only one that worked when everything else failed. Today, every time a helicopter lifts off, it carries Sikorsky's signature. After the first successful flights, Sikorsky's reputation soared, but official acceptance did not come easily. The Army and Navy, embarrassed by years of skepticism, were slow to embrace the helicopter as anything more than a curiosity. Behind closed doors, resistance lingered. Some called the R-4 fragile, underpowered, or a flying accident waiting to happen. Others argued that fixed-wing aircraft would always be faster, safer, and more useful. Sikorsky had made the establishment look foolish, and institutional pride was slow to forgive. But the evidence was impossible to ignore. Within months, the helicopter's value was proven in the harshest conditions imaginable. In Burma, the R-4's rescue of wounded soldiers behind enemy lines made headlines around the world. In the Pacific, helicopters delivered supplies to jungle outposts and evacuated the wounded from places no airplane could reach. The same generals who once dismissed Sikorsky's toy now watched as it saved lives day after day. The helicopter was no longer a fantasy. It was a lifeline. Adoption spread rapidly. By 1945, Sikorsky's designs were being built under license in Britain and flown by the Royal Air Force. The US Navy used helicopters for submarine spotting and search and rescue missions. The Coast Guard began training pilots for peacetime rescues. The helicopter's unique ability to hover, land almost anywhere, and lift straight up changed the logic of war, rescue, and transport. Sikorsky's company became a hub of innovation, refining rotor designs, improving engines, and training a new generation of pilots and engineers. Every test, every mission, every failure was logged and studied. The laboratory that began in a cold Connecticut hangar became the world's center for rotary wing flight. But here is what most people don't know. For years, Sikorsky's contribution was quietly downplayed by rivals and even by the government. Patents were challenged, credit was shared, and the true story of the single-rotor breakthrough was often buried in technical reports. Sikorsky's name rarely appeared in post-war histories. When the Korean War erupted, helicopters were suddenly everywhere, airlifting wounded from the battlefield, delivering supplies to mountaintop outposts, and performing daring rescues under fire. The whirlybird became a symbol of hope, but few knew the story of the immigrant who made it possible. Today, if you ride in a medevac helicopter, watch a wildfire being fought from the air, or see a news chopper hovering over a city, you are experiencing Sikorsky's legacy. Every time a helicopter lifts off from a hospital roof, lands on a ship at sea, or hovers over a disaster zone, it is following the blueprint Sikorsky drew in 1939. The single main rotor and tail rotor configuration, once dismissed as crude and dangerous, is now the global standard. The principles Sikorsky established, simplicity, reliability, and the courage to embrace the flaw, still guide every helicopter built today. Sikorsky died in 1972, aged 83. He left behind no monuments, only machines and a philosophy. His work bridged the age of fixed-wing flight and the era of vertical lift, proving that progress depends not on genius alone, but on persistence, humility, and the willingness to learn from failure. He once wrote, "The work of the individual still remains the spark that moves mankind ahead." That idea still drives every rescue, every mission, every quiet moment when a helicopter's blades cut the air. Igor Sikorsky, the refugee who solved the helicopter's deadliest flaw, gave the 20th century its silent lifeline. And every time a helicopter rises, somewhere in the world, his signature is written in the sky.